I never thought that the end of something would lead to the beginning of everything. A year ago, I was lost, drifting through life, holding on to something that was never meant for me. I had spent so many years chasing love, trying to find validation in someone else's affection, believing that love would fill the voids I carried within myself. And for so long, it felt like the only thing that mattered. But in the end, love was my undoing. I had always believed that love was a destination, a goal, something that, once achieved, would make everything fall into place. I was willing to sacrifice my own dreams, my own desires, my own sense of self for the hope that someone else could give me what I so desperately wanted. I thought that if I loved enough, gave enough, that love would somehow make me whole. But I had been wrong. In the process of chasing love, I had lost myself. I had allowed someone else's opinions of me to define my worth. Every mistake, every betrayal, every unfulfilled promise became another weight on my heart, another reason to doubt who I was. The person I had become was nothing more than a reflection of someone else's expectations, someone I thought I couldn't live without. The turning point came when I finally realized that love, the way I had been chasing it, was never going to be enough. I had been chasing something that didn't exist, something that only existed in my mind, built up from years of dreams and fantasies. And in doing so, I had forgotten to chase my own dreams. I had forgotten to live for myself. I had been clinging to a relationship that was toxic, hoping it would change, hoping he would see me the way I had always wanted him to. But when he left, when he finally made it clear that I wasn't enough, that my love wasn't enough, it shattered me. At first, I thought I couldn't survive it. I thought I would never recover from the loss. But in that pain, in that brokenness, I saw something that I had never seen before, a chance to rebuild. That was when I was reborn. It wasn't an instant transformation. There was no moment of epiphany that made everything click into place. It took time, and there were moments when I still doubted myself. There were days when I still wanted to call him, still wanted to fall back into the familiar, even though I knew it would only pull me deeper into the same cycle of disappointment and hurt. But every day, I chose to walk away from the past. Every day, I chose to walk towards something new, and it wasn't love. It was success. I realized that success wasn't just about achieving career goals or financial independence. It was about reclaiming my power, finding the strength to define myself on my own terms, without anyone else's approval. Success was about learning to love myself first and foremost, not waiting for someone else to give me that love. I wasn't going to chase after someone who didn't see my worth. I was going to build my own worth. It was a painful journey, one that forced me to confront the parts of myself that I had long buried, the insecurities, the fears, the self-doubt. But as I faced those demons head-on, I realized that I was stronger than I had ever known. I didn't need to chase love. Love would find me when I was whole, when I had healed and become the person I was always meant to be. So, I stopped chasing love. I started chasing my own success. I set my sights on my career, my dreams, my passions. I took risks. I worked harder than I ever had before. I learned to trust myself, to believe in my own abilities, and to walk confidently into a future I was determined to create for myself. And when the love I had been searching for finally came into my life, it wasn't because I had chased it. It was because I had become someone who didn't need anyone else to define her. Someone who was strong, independent, and whole. This is the story of how I learned that true success doesn't come from chasing love. It comes from loving yourself first. It comes from building a life that you're proud of, one where you don't need anyone else to validate your worth. It comes from finding your own path and walking it with confidence. This is my rebirth. And now I'm ready to show the world what it looks like when you stop chasing and start living for yourself. Looking back, I can see now how foolish I was. How I had given so much of myself to someone who had never truly appreciated me. At the time, I didn't know it was foolish. I didn't know that I was slowly losing myself to someone else's image of who I should be. I thought that love, his love, would be the answer to everything. But instead, it became the root of my pain, my regret, and my deepest confusion. It all began so innocently. The early days were filled with laughter, with sweet words, with promises of forever. He was everything I had ever wanted. A kind smile, a gentle touch, a reassuring voice. I was hooked from the first moment. He made me feel seen, special, like I was the one he had been waiting for. I believed him. I believed that this was the love I had been searching for. The love that would finally make everything in my life fall into place. But over time, things changed. They always do. I didn't notice at first, because love makes you blind to the things that matter. At first, it was small things, those little moments when he wasn't quite as present as he used to be. He became more distant, more preoccupied. He was busy, distracted. But I told myself it was just a phase. Everyone has their problems, their stresses, right? I thought it was just temporary. But the cracks in our relationship deepened, and I couldn't ignore them forever. It started with his indifference. When I needed him the most, he was never there. I would come home after a long day, hoping for a kind word, a simple gesture that showed me he cared. But more often than not, he was absorbed in his phone, his work, his own world. I tried to fill the silence with more affection, more gestures, more love. I thought that if I gave more, he would give more in return. But he didn't. And when I confronted him about it, I was met with excuses, deflections. "You're overreacting," he'd say. "It's just a busy time at work." Or, "You're too emotional. I'm just tired." Each time I accepted it. I believed him. But inside, I began to feel the cracks spreading further, deeper, until I was no longer sure of anything. Was it me? Was I too much? Was my love not enough? Then came the lies. The first lie was easy to dismiss. A missed call here, a vague explanation there. But as time went on, the lies became harder to ignore. He'd disappear for hours without telling me where he was. When I asked, his answers were always vague, never quite adding up. I was scared to question him, scared to face the truth. But deep down, I could feel something wasn't right. The turning point came one night when I stumbled upon a message on his phone. It wasn't just a casual text. It was an intimate conversation, filled with words I had never heard him speak to me. The tone, the affection, the promises of always and forever were reserved for someone else, someone I didn't know. I confronted him immediately, my heart racing in my chest, my mind spinning with disbelief. "Who is she?" I asked, the words choking me. He hesitated, just long enough to make me question whether I had been right all along. Then, with a coldness that still haunts me, he shrugged. "It's nothing. Just someone I've been talking to. You're always so busy. You don't give me the attention I need." It wasn't nothing. It was everything. It was the validation of every fear I had buried deep inside me, every doubt I had pushed aside for the sake of the relationship. He had been seeing someone else, someone who had filled the emotional gap I had failed to notice. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how he made me feel. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to explain. He didn't even feel guilty. Instead, he made it clear that I had driven him to this. I wasn't enough for him. My love wasn't enough. And in that moment, I felt like I was suffocating. Like the world had suddenly become a much smaller, colder place. I tried to forgive him. I tried to convince myself that it was a mistake, that we could work through it. But I couldn't. How could I? The trust was gone. The love I had poured into him, into us, had been wasted. It was like I was invisible to him. Like everything I had sacrificed for him didn't matter. The next few months were a blur. I kept waiting for him to change, for him to prove that he could love me the way I had loved him. But every day I found myself being pushed further away. He became colder, more detached. He didn't need me anymore. His affair had filled the hole I had once filled, and I was left standing in the ruins of a relationship that had never been what I thought it was. I began to see that I had been the one who had been wrong. I had given everything to someone who never truly valued me. I had spent so much time trying to make him happy, trying to meet his needs, that I had lost sight of myself. I had lost my identity, my self-worth, in the pursuit of someone else's affection. And when he finally left, it wasn't a dramatic scene. It was just a quiet, empty departure. The door closed behind him, and with it, everything I had once believed in. For the first time, I had no one but myself to rely on. I was broken, but in that brokenness, something else stirred, something I hadn't recognized before. A quiet voice telling me that I didn't need anyone else to feel whole. I had the power to rebuild myself, to find my own worth without relying on someone else's validation. And that's when I realized the love I had been chasing wasn't real. The love I had needed wasn't something that someone else could give me. It was something I had to give myself. And so, in that painful moment, I decided that I would no longer chase love. I would find my own success. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to be the same person who had been lost in someone else's world. This was my chance to start over, to build the life I had always wanted. And this time, I would do it for me. The moment the door slammed shut behind him, leaving me alone in a silence that was both comforting and terrifying, I realized that I had two choices. I could stay in this dark place where my heart still ached from betrayal, or I could step into the light, into a future where I wasn't defined by the man who had left me. And in that moment, I chose the latter. I chose to rebuild. Not just my life, but myself. The first thing I did was stop crying. It sounds simple, doesn't it? But it was one of the hardest things I had to do. I had spent so much time wallowing in sorrow, thinking that if I cried enough, the pain would disappear. But the truth was, every tear only dragged me deeper into a hole I couldn't escape. I couldn't afford to stay there any longer. If I was going to move forward, I needed to let go of the past, of the relationship that had drained me emotionally, and of the idea that I needed him to be happy. I started small. It wasn't about drastic changes overnight. It was about taking deliberate steps that would lead me to something greater. I began with my daily routine. The first thing I changed was how I started my day. Instead of lying in bed, scrolling through old messages and reminders of him, I forced myself to get up. I made my bed. It seemed like such a small thing, but it was the first act of self-discipline I had done for myself in months, maybe years. Next, I focused on my health. In my relationship, I had neglected my body. I had eaten whatever was convenient, skipped workouts, and allowed stress to control my physical well-being. But now I had no one else to rely on, no one to make excuses for. I had to take responsibility for myself. I signed up for a gym membership. I hated the thought of working out at first, but I quickly realized how liberating it was to push my body, to feel the sweat pouring down my face, to realize that I was still strong, stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. The endorphins were a welcome relief from the fog of sadness that had once clouded my mind. I wasn't just getting fitter, I was healing. But physical strength wasn't enough. I knew that to truly change, I needed to rebuild my mind. The self-doubt, the feelings of inadequacy, the constant comparison to others had to stop. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of someone else's love, someone else's expectations. I needed to define myself on my own terms. I wanted to become someone I could be proud of. I started reading books, books that inspired me, books that taught me to trust myself. I began journaling, writing out my thoughts, my dreams, my fears. I had always been too afraid to confront my own emotions head on, but now it felt like the only way to make sense of the mess I had been in. I began setting goals for myself, not just for the short term, but for the long haul. I wanted to be financially independent. I wanted to be emotionally strong, and I wanted to rediscover the passions I had buried under the weight of trying to please someone else. I looked at my career, something I had once been so passionate about, but had allowed to fall by the wayside. I had spent so much time focusing on the man I loved, on making sure he was happy, that I had forgotten my own ambitions. But no longer. It was time to invest in myself. I reached out to colleagues, reconnected with old mentors, and dove back into the world of work. I set new goals for myself, goals that challenged me, that pushed me beyond my comfort zone. I was no longer just living day by day. I was planning for my future. I was determined to build something I could be proud of, something that wasn't dependent on anyone else. But all of this was just the foundation. The biggest transformation I had to make was in my heart. I had to forgive myself. I had spent so much time blaming myself for everything that had gone wrong. I blamed myself for not seeing the red flags, for giving too much of myself to someone who never deserved it. I had let my self-worth become tied to another person's opinion of me, and that was my biggest mistake. I started practicing self-love. It wasn't easy at first, but I forced myself to do things that made me feel good about myself. I spent time doing the things I loved: reading, painting, taking long walks in the park. I reconnected with the things that once brought me joy, the things that had been lost in the noise of trying to make someone else happy. Slowly, I began to remember who I was before him, before his love became my obsession. I also learned to set boundaries. In my past life, I had allowed people to walk all over me. I had allowed my fears and insecurities to keep me trapped in situations that didn't serve me. But now, I was learning to say no. No to things that drained me. No to people who didn't respect me. It wasn't about being selfish, it was about protecting my peace. I had spent so much time giving and giving, only to be left empty. Now I was filling my own cup. Every small step I took was a victory. Every time I set a boundary, every time I reached a new milestone, I felt the old version of me, the one who had been desperate for validation, slip away. The more I focused on my own growth, the less I felt the need to chase after love. I realized that love would come when I was ready, when I was whole. And I didn't need to chase it. I needed to let it find me when I was the best version of myself. As the days passed, I began to see the changes in my life. My career was taking off again. I had made new friends who valued me for who I was, and I felt healthier, stronger, and more confident than I ever had before. I wasn't perfect, but I wasn't broken anymore. I had found the strength to rise from the ashes of my past life, to build a future that was mine. And as I stood there, looking at the woman I had become, I felt a surge of pride. I wasn't chasing love anymore. I was chasing success. And in that success, I had found something even more precious: myself. Just when I thought I had everything under control, just as I was starting to feel truly liberated, Ethan came back into my life in a way I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a call, not a pleading message. It was subtle, too subtle, but the impact was enough to shake me to my core. It started with a simple message, A text that I hadn't expected but somehow knew would come. It was from him. "We need to talk. I know I hurt you, but I still care about you. Please, let's meet." Part of me wanted to ignore it. I had made it clear to myself that I was done with him, that I had moved on. But another part of me, the part I hated to admit, still cared. I had spent so long wondering if he would come back, if he would regret leaving me. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about knowing that the man who had broken me might finally see the woman I had become. But I knew that seeing him would bring me right back into that cycle, the one I had fought so hard to escape. He hadn't been part of my plan, and he didn't deserve to be. Still, the temptation lingered. I stared at my phone for a long moment, the message blinking back at me, waiting for a response. My hands shook slightly as I typed. "I'm done, Ethan. It's over." I hit send, and the finality of it hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had told myself I was ready to move forward, that I wouldn't be swayed. But even then, I felt the sting of doubt creeping in. Was I really as strong as I thought? Was I truly ready to shut that door for good? But then the doorbell rang. I wasn't prepared for him to show up on my doorstep. I hadn't given him permission to re-enter my life. But there he was, standing in front of me like he belonged, like nothing had changed. "I had to see you," he said, his voice soft, almost pleading. "I've made a mistake. I've seen how strong you've become. I've seen the changes, and I know now I was wrong. Please, let's talk. I'm not the same person I was before." I stood there, frozen, staring at him. The man who had torn my heart apart was standing before me, looking like a stranger, like a man who had learned nothing from the pain he had caused. I wanted to slam the door in his face, to scream at him that he had no right to be here. But a part of me, the part that had been broken, wanted to hear him out. It wanted to believe him, to believe that the love I had given him could be redeemed. But I didn't need his words anymore. I didn't need him to complete me. The woman standing before him wasn't the same as the one he had abandoned, and that realization was the key to my strength. "No, Ethan," I said firmly, stepping back from the door. "You don't get to come back into my life like nothing happened. I gave you everything. I loved you unconditionally, and you used that love to hurt me. You don't get to undo that with empty promises. I'm done." His face fell. The mask of confidence that he wore cracked, and for a moment, I saw vulnerability. For a moment, I saw the man who had once been my everything, the man who had broken me. But it was too late. His time was over. "I'm not better than you, Ethan," I said, my voice steady. "But I am better than I was. And that's enough for me. You don't get to have a say in my life anymore. Not now. Not ever." He stood there for a moment, seething with anger, his eyes burning with the frustration of being rejected once again. I could see the mask of control slipping away, revealing the man who had never truly cared, who had never really seen me for who I was. "You think this is over? You think you can just move on and pretend I didn't exist?" He spat, his voice cold and venomous. "You'll regret this. I promise you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing at the door. His words hung in the air, but this time, they didn't have the power to break me. I watched him walk down the street, disappearing into the distance, and I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. I was no longer afraid of him. I was no longer afraid of the power he once held over me. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new battle. In the following days, things began to escalate. Ethan didn't give up. He reached out to my friends, trying to turn them against me. He tried to manipulate people into thinking that I was the one who had pushed him away, that I was the one who had broken everything. His lies spread like wildfire, and for a moment, I could feel the doubt creeping in. What if he was right? What if I had made a mistake? But then I remembered everything I had fought for. I remembered the woman I had become, the woman who didn't need anyone to validate her. I wasn't going to let him destroy me again. I wasn't going to let his lies break me. I went public. I didn't do it out of anger or revenge. I did it because I had nothing to hide. I shared my story with the world, not to get sympathy, but to show others that they didn't have to live in silence. They didn't have to accept the lies. And as I exposed the truth, I began to see the cracks in Ethan's facade. People started to see him for who he truly was: manipulative, deceitful, and cold. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't the one who needed to regret anything. He was. The tension between us reached a boiling point, and I knew that the final showdown was coming. But this time, I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. I was going to stand tall, knowing that no matter what he did, I had already won. The final confrontation had arrived, and with it, I felt a calm that surprised me. The whirlwind of emotions, the fear, the anger, it had all dissipated into something steadier, something more resolute. I wasn't the person I had been when Ethan first walked out of my life. I wasn't the person who had cried for days, begging for a love that wasn't real. I had become someone unrecognizable, someone who would never beg for anyone's affection again. This was no longer a battle for revenge or validation. This was a battle for my peace, for my future, and I was ready for it. I had already moved past the lies. I had already exposed the truth. Ethan, in his desperation, had tried to slander me, to paint me as the villain in our story, but the truth was undeniable. I had shared my story openly, and the support I received was overwhelming. My friends, my colleagues, and even strangers reached out to tell me how brave I was. In a way, the public exposure didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an inevitable consequence of everything he had put me through. What I realized in the quiet aftermath was that my peace didn't depend on whether he regretted his actions. It didn't depend on his apology, his acknowledgement, or his remorse. It only depended on me. I was the one who held the power now. He had tried to control me through manipulation and fear, but I had learned the most important lesson. My worth was never tied to his opinion. I didn't need him to acknowledge me for my life to be meaningful. I had created something for myself, something that was mine, and no one could take that from me. But as much as I had grown, as much as I had learned to trust myself, I knew that I had to see this through to the end. I had to close this chapter completely. I couldn't let his shadow linger any longer in my life. I was about to take the final step when I received the call I had been expecting. Ethan, in his frustration, had decided to take things one step further. He had reached out to the people closest to me, my business partners, my friends, and tried to poison their opinions of me, to turn them against me. But this time, I was prepared. I didn't wait for him to manipulate me into another confrontation. Instead, I called a meeting with everyone involved. I laid everything out. I didn't sugarcoat the truth. I didn't try to make myself look better or him look worse. I simply told my side of the story, the facts, the evidence, the impact his actions had on my life and business. I didn't do it out of anger or spite. I did it because I was done hiding. I wasn't going to let him smear my reputation any longer. What happened next was beyond anything I could have expected. My team, my friends, and even my closest business partners stood by me. They had seen me grow. They had seen the woman I had become. And in that moment, I realized just how far I had come. I had created a life built on my own merits. And that was something no one, not even Ethan, could take away from me. Ethan, on the other hand, was left scrambling. The walls he had built to control me were falling apart. The more he tried to manipulate others, the more he exposed himself as the liar, the coward, the manipulator that he truly was. As people began to see through his tactics, his influence started to dwindle. His own reputation, once built on charm and deceit, began to erode. The damage he had caused had come full circle, and now, the consequences were his to face. But it wasn't just Ethan who was left reeling. The shift in my life, the choices I had made, had transformed everything around me. My career soared. My business expanded beyond anything I could have dreamed. What had once been a small idea, a desperate attempt to build something, anything, had turned into an empire. I had taken control of my destiny, and every step I took was a reminder of just how far I had come. It wasn't just the success that mattered. It was the empowerment that came with it. I had learned to trust myself, to make decisions not based on fear or the need for approval, but on what I knew was right. I had surrounded myself with people who supported me, who believed in me, who wanted to see me succeed. For the first time in my life, I realized that I didn't need anyone else to validate me. I was enough, just as I was. And then came the final blow to Ethan. One day, I received a message from an old acquaintance, a mutual friend who had seen the wreckage Ethan had left behind. This person, a former colleague of his, reached out to me with information that sealed Ethan's fate. Ethan's lies, his manipulation, his toxic behavior. It was all laid bare for everyone to see. His betrayal of not just me, but several other people in his life became public. People who had once trusted him began to turn away. The truth about him was out, and he was left with nothing but his regrets. But the best part of it all wasn't watching him fall. It was knowing that I had taken the power back. I wasn't a victim of his manipulations. I wasn't a casualty of his charm. I was a survivor, a warrior who had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. I had learned to embrace the truth about myself, about my worth, and about the life I deserved. And as I stood in the place I had fought so hard to get to, I realized that everything I had been through had led me to this moment. The woman I had become was a force to be reckoned with. I was no longer the girl who had chased love. I was the woman who had found success, not just in business, but in life. I had found the strength to let go of the past and embrace the future. The journey wasn't easy, but it was worth every step. And in the end, I knew that the person who had once tried to destroy me was the same person who had unknowingly paved the way for my success. This was my victory. This was my life. The months that followed felt like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocating under the weight of my past. I had built a life that was no longer defined by someone else's actions. The power I had given away so freely to others, specifically to Ethan, had been reclaimed. And with it, I realized something profound. I didn't need anyone to validate my worth. I was enough, just as I was. In the years before, my happiness had been a fragile thing, dependent on the ups and downs of a relationship, on the whims of someone who had never truly understood me. But now, my happiness was solid, unshakable. I had forged it myself, through my work, my passions, and the relationships that truly mattered. My career had taken off in ways I could never have imagined. I had worked tirelessly to create something for myself, and now I could finally see the fruits of my labor. My business had grown into something substantial, with a strong foundation of loyal clients, dedicated employees, and a team that believed in me. It wasn't just about the financial success. It was about the respect I had earned, the trust I had built, and the knowledge that I had created something that was mine and mine alone. There was no one else's influence in it, no one else's shadow hanging over it. This success was mine because I had worked for it, because I had refused to allow anything or anyone to stand in my way. But even more than that, I had built a new sense of self. I had spent so many years feeling like I wasn't enough, trying to prove my worth to others, trying to win someone's affection. But in the process, I had lost sight of the most important thing: my relationship with myself. I had learned that true love, real, lasting love, doesn't come from someone else. It comes from within. I had learned to love myself, to appreciate the woman I had become, and that was the foundation on which everything else was built. When I looked back, it was clear to me that my greatest success wasn't the career or the financial security. It wasn't even the relationships I had built or the recognition I had earned. My greatest success was the transformation I had undergone, the fact that I had walked away from someone who had broken me and had emerged stronger, more confident, and more in control of my own destiny than ever before. And yet, despite all of this, I knew that the road ahead was still long. Life wasn't perfect, and I wasn't naive enough to believe that it would be. There would still be challenges, still be moments when I would feel doubt creeping in. But I had learned the most important lesson of all. I was capable of overcoming anything. I had proven that to myself time and time again, and nothing, no one, could take that away from me. In the months following my breakthrough, I began to open my heart again. Not to Ethan, not to anyone from my past, but to new possibilities, to new people who respected me for who I was and who I had become. I reconnected with old friends who had always believed in me, who had supported me even when I couldn't see my own worth. I forged new relationships with people who were on similar journeys of self-discovery, people who wanted to lift each other up, not tear each other down. It wasn't about finding love in the way I had before. It was about finding the love that comes from mutual respect, shared values, and emotional connection. And love did come to me, but not in the way I had once imagined. It wasn't the fairy tale romance I had once dreamed of. It wasn't the kind of love that required me to lose myself. It was the kind of love that was grounded, steady, and reciprocal. It was a love built on trust, on understanding, and on the realization that I was already whole without anyone else. In the quiet moments, when I looked back on everything, I saw that the pain I had endured, the betrayals I had suffered, had led me to a place where I could finally see the truth. I was never broken. I had only needed to realize that my worth wasn't tied to anyone else's opinion of me. I was enough. Then, now, and always. When I thought about Ethan, I felt no anger. I had forgiven him, not for him, but for me. I had let go of the need for revenge, for him to regret his actions, because I realized that his regret meant nothing to me. What mattered was that I had become the person I had always needed to be, the person who could stand on her own, who didn't need anyone to validate her existence. Ethan had been a chapter in my life, but he was no longer the author of my story. I had taken the pen from his hand and rewritten my own narrative. And with each new page, I wrote the story of a woman who was whole, who was strong, and who had learned to stand proudly in her own skin. The future was mine, and I was ready to face it with all the strength I had found within myself. I wasn't chasing love anymore. I wasn't chasing anyone. I was chasing my own dreams, and nothing could stop me. This was just the beginning, and I was ready.